Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to talk to you about one of the great questions of humanity, which is how did life originate on the planet Earth? And so that's right, I'm going to attempt to answer that, although I'm not sure if it's going to leave you satisfied, but I'm going to give you everything I can tell you about that idea. Before we get into the origin of life, however, I want to sort of kick around this illustration right here. Sort of a cartoon drawing of a tree where you have various branches that are coming off this one trunk that's extending outward. And as you can see here, there's a lot of diverse forms of life on it. And so this is what we consider to be the idea that all life on the planet Earth is basically one continuum. In other words, every living thing has a common ancestor if you go far back enough. And so sure, there are different branches and some organisms are more closely related to others, but all organisms descended from a common ancestor. And so each of these branches, or phylogenetic branches as sometimes we refer to them, give us the great forms of life that we have today. And this idea was brought forth in the 1800s in Charles Darwin's famous book on the origin of species by way of natural selection in 1859. And Darwin made 2 points in that book, which is today's organisms are descendant from ancestral species. And again, this book, I welcome you to take a look at this. This book does not have very many illustrations, but it does have this idea here where you could see that Darwin is thinking that somehow organisms that are living today are descendant from a common ancestor and that they basically branch out and speciate. What's interesting is the mechanism of change. The mechanism of evolutionary change is natural selection. And so he brought forth those 2 concepts. But I want to talk to you about the very first form of life. And so let's just what do we know? Because the truth is, before we get into any more detail, is we don't know for sure how life originated. So that's a little bit of a spoiler alert right there. But basically we have some ideas, we have some thoughts about how it may have occurred. But what we do know for certain is we have evidence of the first celled organisms. And our first fossils, if you will, are called stromatolites. So kind of a cool word, stromatolites. And these are basically rocks that have formed from the accumulation of many layers of sediments. And basically they're mats, like a welcome mat of bacteria, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And so these date back to pretty far back, 3.5 billion years ago. So we know that life occurs on the planet Earth 3.5 billion years ago. So again, if you're not familiar with it, this is a mind-boggling amount of time. And so I don't think that you should be like, wow, it's hard to relate to that. Of course it's hard to relate to that. But just to give you some idea, that we believe that the Earth itself formed 4.5 billion years ago. So it took about 1 billion years for this to occur, these bacteria to start to grow. And so what I find interesting is that these prokaryotes, or which no nucleus bacteria, were Earth's sole inhabitants from the 3.5 billion to basically 2 billion. So billion years, basically the prokaryotes are living on this Earth. That's a long period of time. And so again, no animals, no plants, no fungi, and certainly no humans. And so bacteria, not surprisingly, dominate the Earth. And so just a couple of general concepts about this. Geological effects have altered the environment, of course. And so we have mountains forming, and we have volcanoes, and we have great rivers forming canyons. And, probably one of the most important geological events was the breakup of this supercontinent called Pangea. And of course, when all of the continents were once united in one landmass, when these started to separate and move in their different directions like this, obviously organisms were trapped on these so-called islands. And as they moved apart, each individual continent is subject to its own environmental pressures, and therefore put different selective pressures on those organisms, and so that it's a major event in terms of the diversity of life on the planet Earth. So geological events impact the diversity of life. And of course, life conversely impacts the environment. For example, photosynthetic organisms, like for example in the ocean, release copious amounts of oxygen, which not only is found in the ocean, but and also goes up into the atmosphere, which then affects the planet. And so life impacts the planet, the natural environment, and the environment affects life. And so no organism, no species in history has had more of a change on the land and water and on air than our species, Homo sapien. We basically are dominating in an unprecedented way, and not always for the good. And so this video is not really about the effects of humans on the environment. It's about the origin of life. But I just wanted to point out this picture of San Francisco and this beautiful picture of AT&T Park, home of the world champion San Francisco Giants. But look what we've changed. Obviously, San Francisco wasn't like this before. And so humans are affecting the habitat as well as pollution and introduced species. We're affecting organisms in a way unprecedented. And sadly, that's having a negative effect. Now, in the past, there's been 5 major mass extinction events where literally 83%, 75% of all species, 96% of all species. And then the latest one, 65 million years ago, put an end to the dinosaurs. And so this last one, the 6th mass extinction that we believe that we're currently in, is being a direct result of human interaction with the planet, whereas these other mass extinctions were caused by more environmental reasons, like for example a meteor striking the Earth causing the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. So when you look at life's tree, you could look at this sort of chronologically in terms of time. You could put it in a line, or you can branch it out like this. So the origin of the Earth, 4.5 billion years ago. The origin of life probably occurred earlier than we have evidence for, but the first evidence is around 3.5 billion years ago. And we can work our way up. The oldest eukaryotic fossil, fairly recent. Multicellular organisms, fairly recent. And again, the oldest animal fossil, fairly recent. And again, humans coming in right at the very end. Sometimes it's more appropriate to look at it sort of as a clock, and you can see when prokaryotes came, they're still with us till today. So prokaryotes, this is basically a prokaryotic world we live in. And then you could see the generation of oxygen on the planet Earth, the single-celled organisms, the multicellular organisms. So we're putting on layers. And again, land plants and animals, and then humans come in right at the very end. And so we could look at it as sort of this clock analogy. So where did the first cells arise? The origin of life. Where did these first cells come about? Well, in order to discuss the first cell, what we really want to talk about are how did the first organic molecules arise? Because basically a cell is a coalesce of organic molecules. Like for example, in this picture, phospholipids, and inside we have proteins and nucleic acids and sugars. So basically, we would like to ask the question, of course, where did the first cell come from? Or how did it arise? But we need to ask the question that preempts this, which is how do organic compounds arise? And again, what we mean by organic compounds are things that contain carbon, like that, carbon molecules. Maybe one of the most important ones would be something like an amino acid, something that has an amino group like this, and then a central carbon and a carboxylic acid. So where did these amino acids come from? They're pretty small. There's 20 of them naturally occurring in cells. And so where did these things come from on the planet Earth? This is our question. So the first cells may have originated by sort of a chemical evolution on the young Earth. In other words, the molecules basically interact with one another and they change and they manifest into a cell. And so most scientists sort of favor that hypothesis that life on Earth developed from non-living organic molecules until they became ordered into like aggregates, like in other words a phospholipid bilayer, and they became self-replicating and they developed their own metabolism. But I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait a minute, like life coming from non-life, I mean, isn't that something that we disproved a long time ago? Yeah, but you might know this historically, that we, the humans, believed in spontaneous generation for quite a few centuries. From the time of the Greek all the way up to the 19th century, we believed, it was kind of common knowledge, that life could arise from non-living matter, that flies would come from a rotting piece of meat, or that mice would come from a barrel of grain, that kind of thing. And we just weren't really looking too closely or conducting any experiments. You might remember this famous experiment conducted by the great Italian scientist Redi, and how he sealed up one piece of meat and showed that no flies could come. It was only that flies that lay their eggs that were microscopic eventually became the maggots that formed the adult flies. And so while the idea of spontaneous life coming from non-life has been rejected, basically for microscopic life it sort of persisted. In other words, we still kind of were holding on to the rope for why something would spoil. In other words, why would, if you had a glass of apple juice and you were sitting, if it was just sitting out there, and then suddenly mold would start to grow on it, and you're like, well, of course it comes from the apple juice. It sort of was still holding on to this until, of course, one of the great biologists of all time, Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur in 1862, again, fairly recent. This is after Charles Darwin, I'm riling up right here. This is after Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species by way of natural selection, 1859. We were still thinking that spontaneous generation could still occur. Life could come from non-living things. And of course, you may recall the experiment, but I'll refresh you. He basically took a broth and then he boiled it, and so sterilizing it. And then he created this flask that had this swan neck. And then when you wait, even though it's open to the air, there would be no growth. And so pasteurization, you might be familiar with that, comes from Louis Pasteur. And so to sterilize it, there'd be no growth. And you're like, well, what does it mean? Well, it's only when you break the flask open and expose it to the air that microscopic germs can come in there and things can grow. And so spontaneous generation was shown to be not the case, that life only comes from existing life. And so when he sterilized the broth, there was no life that was able to grow. And so sterile broth would spoil only if microorganisms could invade it. And so you're like, well, what are you getting so far into this for? Well, I want to establish the fact that life can only come from life. And so today life arises only by the reproduction of pre-existing life. Sometimes you may have heard of it as one of the components of the cell theory. In other words, cells beget other cells. It's the principle of biogenesis, that you can only have life coming from an existing cell. In other words, non-life doesn't produce life. However, if you go back to the origin of matter, you had to have come from non-life. This first cell had to come from somewhere. And so even though there's no evidence that spontaneous generation occurs today, cells come from pre-existing cells, the conditions on the early Earth were very different. Okay, let's kick that around. So the Earth before life. So we, as I mentioned before, that we believe the Earth formed around 4.5 billion years ago, along with the rest of the solar system. And so pretty warm, conditions were pretty out of control. The atmosphere was different. It's very hot. And so there's very little atmospheric oxygen that we're pretty confident about. This is where things get a little iffy in terms of our knowledge, because of course none of us were back there to measure it for sure. But so we could make some interpretations about what we believe it was like. We believe there were energy sources such as lightning occurring. We believe that there was a lot of volcanic action in the early Earth. And we believe there was a lot of ultraviolet light that was coming down from the sun, because today we have ozone protecting that amount of ultraviolet light. And so there was also heavy bombardment of the Earth by rocks coming from outer space and ice that likely vaporized any water because it was so hot, and so preventing seas from forming until somewhere between 4.2 and 3.9 billion years ago. So the Earth was pretty radical place, if you can imagine. And so one of the more credible hypotheses is that the chemicals on the Earth that were present and the physical processes, ultraviolet light and heat, in the primordial environmental Earth eventually produced a simple cell. So in other words, from this early Earth came the organic molecules that eventually became the first cell. So that's what I want to talk about. So under that hypothetical scenario, this is what would had to have occurred. So there needs to be the abiotic synthesis, in other words, just naturally forming of small organic molecules, like for example, amino acids or nucleotides or sugars. And then these would need to form into polymers, because some of the more important molecules in the cell are polymers. And so if we had small monomers forming, we would then link them together like this, and they would form dimers, and then you continue this process, and eventually polymers would form. And you'd get proteins, which are polypeptides, or you get polynucleotides. And then these molecules would then be self-replicating. In other words, the nucleotide sequence would become a template for the replication of something that was exactly like it. And so therefore you would get reproduction to occur. And then these molecules would need to be packaged into some sort of phospholipid bilayer, forming something called a protobiont. And so a pre-cell. And there's advantage to this, keeping things in place, having metabolism, being able to store things. And so eventually a cell can emerge from this. So let's talk about this historically. Like, how could this hypothesis ever be tested? Who was the first one to propose these sorts of hypotheses? And can we ever produce something in the lab that can model that? Like, can we create organic molecules in the lab, given the conditions of the early Earth? And would those molecules form polymers? And would they form cells? And so we like to investigate this. And so early on in the 1920s, one of the great Russian scientists, Alexander Opron, postulated that the conditions of the Earth may have favored the synthesis of these organic molecules from inorganic precursors. In other words, inorganic precursors, like you might have ammonia like this, and then you might have carbon dioxide gas, and you of course had water in the Earth's atmosphere, and you might have methane gas, even though that's an organic compound. And he basically thought that maybe if you had enough energy and you start breaking these bonds up, you might be able to form organic molecules. But he never went as far as to test that hypothesis. And he reasoned that it couldn't happen today because the levels of oxygen are so high in the atmosphere that it would interfere with the formation of those organic molecules. And so the synthesis of organic compounds had to have occurred early on in the Earth because the atmosphere was very different than it is today, principally lacking oxygen. And it's like, well, wait a minute, how do we even know what the atmosphere is? Again, this is shaky. We don't know exactly. And so what we now know today is different from scientists in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. But we kind of believe that because of the volcanic eruptions that occur today, these same volcanic eruptions were occurring on the Earth before, and these are the gases. We have nitrogen gas, nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, hydrogen sulfide. So we believe that the early atmosphere consisted of this majority of these gases. Okay, we think that's the case. And so this was a very reducing environment in terms of oxidation reduction. So it would promote the joining together of simple molecules to form more complex ones. And then considering the energy being provided by lightning, ultraviolet light, that would break some bonds and some new ones would form. And so we believe in the primitive atmosphere where UV light was coming down because, again, lack of ozone, that light is coming down like this from the outside and it's causing the birth of organic molecules in the early formation of the Earth. But no one tested this hypothesis until the early 1950s, and this is a rather famous. I feel like I could say that because most science classes cover this experiment. It's quite universally understood to be pretty important, even though it's debated today. But during 1950, the young grad student, not so young maybe in this picture, Stanley Miller, was working with a Nobel Prize winning biochemist named Miller-Urey. And together they wanted to create in the lab the conditions of the early Earth. And so basically they took glass apparatus, they took glass and they attached with these electrodes here and they sparked it. So this chamber right here was a collection of gases that were found in the early Earth. And so they tried to simulate this. And so they put in methane gas in here, and they put in ammonia and hydrogen gases. And they provided the electricity, which might represent lightning. And so this is breaking the bonds, breaking the bonds, breaking the bonds. And then they ran cold water through, like this. And that would cause the gases to chill and then condense. And then what they did over here in this flask was they boiled water because there was water vapor in the atmosphere as well. So they created water vapor. So this is sort of representing the oceans over here being heated, and then this is the atmosphere, the air. And so all of this, and you cool it, and then it starts to rain down, and then you can collect this into a flask. And it's like, guess what's in here? It's not just water. You can test that. You can test this for the presence of amino acids, and they were able to collect amino acids. They were able to collect nucleotides. So they were able to generate in the lab the abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules that are common in life. So that's kind of cool. So it's nothing more than what you'd be able to do in an organic chemistry lab, but it's rather profound because they were trying to create organic molecules specifically to simulate how those organic molecules might have been created on the early Earth. So again, here's the air, here's the ocean, and they send some cold water in there, and then basically in a flask they collect and they're searching for amino acids. So they found amino acids in organic molecules, and you're like, well, there you go. The Earth could have created organic molecules, and then those organic molecules, if I can use this analogy, those organic molecules are kind of like the notes, the musical notes that when you put them together produce the song that is the cell. And so this is how life may have originated. But unfortunately, what we now believe to be the case is that the atmosphere probably wasn't as high in these hydrogen gas, and it probably wasn't as high as in the ammonia gas as Miller-Urey's experiment did. Now, you could conduct this with lower concentrations of these gases and still get organic molecules to be produced, but in smaller quantities. And so you're like, well, maybe this occurred. What are you getting at? Well, certainly there was not a lot of oxygen. So what we do know is that there was not a lot of O2 in the atmosphere because there wasn't a lot of photosynthetic organisms, obviously, if we haven't had the first cell yet. And so the Miller-Urey experiment is still very much debated. in terms of what the early atmosphere was really like, because it's really difficult to produce the quantity of organic molecules necessary if the atmosphere wasn't as rich with these reducing gases, but it could have occurred. So what's some alternative hypotheses? Well, we know that in the very, very bottom of the Earth, there's a lot of volcanic submerged volcanoes, and so these are spewing out hot water, and there's a lot of minerals that are gushing from this in the depths of the ocean. And so this generates a tremendous amount of heat energy, and of course these minerals coupled with some other organic molecules could have produced, in other words, not in the atmosphere or on the surface of the Earth, but rather in the depth of the ocean, organic molecules could have been created. Are you ready for this one? Another possible source for organic monomers on the Earth is they came in from the outside. They came in extraterrestrially. In other words, meteors that have been bombarding the Earth for billions of years. And again, we have meteor craters. There's a lot of them are in the ocean floor, so we don't see them. But even today, we have small meteors, especially when they're really tiny. They don't burn up in the atmosphere. They just come in kind of gently. And guess what? They have organic molecules on them. They have amino acids on them, and they have nucleotides on them, and they've come from outer space. So maybe the Earth was seeded from the outside with organic molecules. That's a possibility. And so, again, laboratory simulations of the Earth have been able to produce these organic polymers. And you're like, well, wait a minute. If you're able to have monomers, that's one thing. But don't you need enzymes to speed this up in order to polymerize? And so these enzymes, which are of course called polymerases, aren't these things needed, polymerases, in order to speed up this process? And you're like, well, I'm not sure. Maybe we didn't need enzymes early on in the Earth. And like, what do you mean? Well, one of the more important enzymes that you might be familiar with is in our salivary glands, one called salivary amylase. It looks like this. It's quite an elaborate polypeptide chain, and it sort of has this active site, and it catalyzes the breakdown of starch. And so it has this sort of tertiary three-dimensional structure. But imagine a world without these proteins, and you were just trying to unite two monomers together, and you're like, well, it would be great if you had a protein because it would just fit in there and it would speed up and it'd be fabulous. But what about just things like clay? And I put this picture of Play-Doh out here because this existed. And so like when you took in the lab, you could take monomers and you can actually drip them into some hot sand or clay, and the clay actually provides a catalyst. Because of its three-dimensional shape, it actually are just simply molten rock. And so this is kind of like what it would have been like on the fresh lava of the Earth or in the deep sea vent, either way. So this could have provided the environment to speed up the polymerization of organic molecules. And so this is how you might get polymers to form. And so potentially, this is how life originated on the Earth. So in this discussion, we talked about the origin of organic molecules, which eventually became the first cell. And so I hope you enjoyed this video on the origin of life, and thanks for watching.